Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay. You're listening to New Discourses Bullets, where I give a short bullet point like summary of a single topic relevant to woke that we all need to understand so we can stop it. And I want to answer a question today. This should be a pretty short episode actually. Is it a psyops or is it real? Or that is it organic? So take a movement like BLM, right? Black Lives Matter. Was that a psyops or was it real? Was it a real movement? Well, it was a real movement, actually. And what I mean by this is that a lot of people were engaged in it because they believed in it, not because of some cynical reasons, right? So when we think of a psychological operation, which is better called an active measure, what we're actually thinking of is that there's kind of like a small number of cynical actors who understand that they're pulling a propaganda heist on people, and they're misleading people to believe something with either agitation or propaganda, as we've discussed in the past. But the thing is that's usually not the goal, especially not in the era that we live in now, which is, you might call it reflexive, following George Soros's logic of creating mass movements, or kind of what that's all derived from is what Mao Zedong called the mass line. And of course, we did a podcast recently on the mass line, where you go among the masses, find out what's agitating them, package it up into a propaganda package, then feed it back to them so it becomes the line from the masses that is reinterpreted in terms of the party and fed back to the masses in order to mobilize the masses. So is that a psyops? Yes, it is, because the government in that case repackaged, or the nefarious actors repackaged the item and fed it to people in a particular way to get them to do a particular thing. So that's definitely political warfare, which is using political and social means to achieve manipulations of a population with hostile intent. So yeah, that's a psyops. That's an active measure. It's a mass line active measure. Fine. But on the other hand, it's a movement that came from the masses, was given back to the masses, is engaged in by the masses, not cynically, but believing it. And in fact, once the thing kind of gets off the ground, so to speak, once it gets its legs under it, once it gets some momentum going, you don't need the psychological operators really to keep it going. The thing can take on a life of its own, so it becomes organic. So they're not going to step back, actually. They're going to keep feeding the fire. But the fact of the matter is that this reflexive process, so now you kind of understand why it's reflexive. This reflexive process is kind of self-perpetuating and self-continuing. And this is actually what we see, whether it's, movements like BLM, whether it's, the woke right in general, overall. These are reflexive movements. What we might want to talk about then is the concept of something I would call, drawing both from Soros's reflexivity and drawing from Hegel, who inspired him with his concept of becoming, something that we might call reflexive becoming. So the idea is that there's not a mass movement doing something stupid, but the bad guys want a mass movement of people doing something stupid. So they start to seed that mass movement. If you want a metaphor to cloud seeding, which is always in the news these days, you can think of that. There's not rain, there's some moisture in the air. So you feed, whether it's sodium nitrate or silver nitrate or whatever other kind of crystals they spray into the air, so that you get dust particles that become nuclei for water vapor to create clouds to create rain, which is real technology, by the way, not getting into the chemtrail thing. So whether you like that metaphor or not, whatever, the point is that you can seed a movement in kind of the same way. A number of provocateurs or agitators can come in, and they want the movement that does not exist to become a movement that's happening. And this is the, flavor of insurrections. This is the flavor of color revolutions. This is the flavor of reflexive becoming. So there's no mass movement, but agents provocateur and propagandists seed the narratives that are necessary to create a movement pointing in a particular direction, feeding off of the agitation of the people themselves, and pointing it in a direction that's productive for their aims, using a kind of, political warfare tactic to do so. And thus you have a movement that's both astroturfed and artificial on the one hand, or if you want, a psyops, leading people into a mass formation, literally, that is not in their best interest. It does not actually match or solve the problem that they have, but that achieves the agendas of some party that's packaged it up for them. But at the same time, what it generates is a organic movement. In other words, what you see is the fusion. If we look back, Van Jones working for Obama said this. It was a big part of the World Economic Forum's programming. You can see it actually quite explicitly, that they were going to have what they called a top-down, bottom-up, inside-out approach. This is the reflexive approach to transforming society. So the idea is that the top-down is going to create the conditions into which there's this feeder stream that's going to channel energy that's already existing in the bottom-up and the grassroots, so that the grassroots are taken off into the wrong direction. So top-down, bottom-up is one object. It's not two separate objects. It's not that you have the top-down doing one thing and the bottom-up doing something else. They are a coordinated object. This is the idea of reflexive becoming, where you transform society. Remember, Soros calls his reflexivity so-called theory of change. And so you transform society by getting them to do this thing that the top-down actually wants them to do, but it fits in with frustrations the bottom-up has. And you, in a sense, cloud seed the frustration to create a movement that you are now channeling and guiding, as Soros puts it, to your own intended goals. So the movement doesn't exist, but it becomes. So as Hegel had it in his famous dialectic of being and nothing, that being is what we observe, that there is being everywhere. Being is all that is, capital B, being. But then it's negated by the idea of nothing. But you can't understand nothing without which is completely incomprehensible, without understanding it as the negation of being. So it's a opposite that's contained within. But there's a way to see dialectically that actually being and nothing are part of the same project, which he called becoming. So becoming is the dialectical completion or synthesis of being and nothing. It's pure negation. So that which is had to come into being, and the process of it coming into being from not being is becoming. It became. And this is the idea that the whole leftist dialectical project, including the woke right, which is a leftist dialectical project wearing right-wing clothing, all uses. So you have this astroturfed psyops that makes a mass movement that becomes mostly self-sufficient under its own logic, at which point the agitprop is meant to keep them inflamed and keep them pointed in certain directions. I bring this up because I want you to be able to see it, and I want you to be able to deal with this question. Is it organic or is it astroturfed? Is it a psyops or is it real? The answer is yes, it is both in a process of becoming. And if you can't understand that they're thinking operationally through a dialectic, using this reflexive method, you can't understand this. Why does that matter? Why do you need to understand this? Well, if you understand this, you can understand that there are, in a sense, think of it like a herd of cows or sheep being driven by people with whips. The problem is the people with whips, not the cows. But if you think that it's the cows, then you're going to start studying cow culture, cow behavior, the ways cows interact to understand why the cows are moving the way they're moving. They're moving the way they're moving because there are people with whips driving them. In other words, you might start saying, oh my God, our culture is just degraded, or our young people are so off base, this is all that they can do. No, actually, there are people literally driving the program. It might be true that they don't have the tools that are necessary for them to be able to understand the circumstances that they're in so that they're easy to drive, but there are still these guys with the whips. And if you take the guys with the whips away and you guide the people who've been caught up in this somewhat better, you actually can solve the problem. In other words, we don't have to come up with complicated cultural explanations for every single reflexive movement. A lot of them are driven in such a way as to look like they are not driven, to make it look like they are a spontaneous, grassroots, organic movement that in fact is not. And so I'm just trying to pull back some of the curtain again to get you to see. I want you to be more suspicious when everybody starts saying or doing or talking about the same thing, and it's a huge fight, maybe online, maybe in your political conversations in real life. You might want to suspect that maybe this dynamic is happening. We know right now, for example, both on left and right, that a massive amount of this is happening coming from Islamic countries to drive Westerners into stupid positions that advance Islamic causes. It's coming through our influencers on the left, posing as communist rhetoric. It's coming through our influencers on the right, posing as big tough guy rhetoric against the degradation of liberal culture or whatever it is that they're mad about. Do you see that this can cause a lot of people who only know a little bit of the details to end up taking up a gigantic propaganda line for themselves and pushing it? But it's a few actors with a coordinated agenda driving a large crowd of people who have better things to do, so that they have a top-down movement that looks bottom-up, top-down, bottom-up. This is reflexive becoming of a political or social movement. And almost every single one of these huge campaigns, mass line campaigns that we see, whether from radical left or radical right, works this way. It's very helpful to understand the dynamics so you can start to look for the drivers and you can start to unplug the drivers. It's very helpful to look for the dynamic because then rather than engaging in the drama, you can name the dynamic and explain that this is an operation, even if you don't know who the players are. These things take away that reflexive potential for this movement to go viral and to do damage. So I hope this is a helpful way to look at it. I know it's a little abstract, but not everything is the way that it seems. And we have to understand that if we are going to live in and navigate a basically permanent propaganda battlefield, which is where we live now if we're connected to the internet.